All right, everyone, we're really glad that you came out to join us today. We're going to be talking a little bit about herb gardening. Everybody's kind of getting the itch. The gardening season's starting to be in full swing. This is a little bit longer presentation than what we normally give. So what I did is I went ahead and left it as the longer version, since you guys can view the PowerPoint later if you'd like to. We will go through some of this a little quick. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them. But that way you can have the information later if you're interested. What we're going to talk a little bit about is we're just going to talk about common uses of herbs, and then we'll talk a little bit about the different production methods and propagation methods if you're interested in growing the herbs. And then we'll talk a little bit better how to store and harvest those herbs. All right, so why do we use herbs? We use herbs for a lot of different things. Of course, probably the most common use is the seasoning, because they have that great flavor that we like. Lots of different kinds of herbs. Many of them are maybe an Italian flavoring, Mexican flavoring, if you like that cilantro. But also for the aroma and scent. I don't know if anybody makes candles out there, but that's one of my favorite. The lavender is one of my favorite in the candles. Also cinnamon around Christmas time. Also, ornamental purposes, just out in your garden, they can be really pretty. We'll talk about some of those here in a little bit. If you'd like to attract pollinators, that can be a great option. And then medicinal herbs. We don't talk a lot about that in extension, but there are a lot of people that believe that herbs can have some medicinal properties as well. So what is an herb? This is something we kind of throw out there. What's the difference between an herb and a vegetable? Generally, we think of an herb as something that we're only using for the scent or the flavoring portion, whereas a vegetable, we would be looking at more the nutritional content. So that's kind of the way we define that, but it is a little bit hairy there. It can kind of vary a little bit either way. So the term herb or herbaceous basically refers to the edible portion of the herb, which could be the leaves, it could be the stem, it could be the roots, it could be the seeds or the flower. It just depends on what type of herb that we're looking at. Realistically, we're looking at a plant that has either a savory or aromatic property. So we could use it for flavoring, garnish, their fragrance. So it's generally something that we're using not for the nutritional content. Their flavor, scents, dyes, or even pest repellent quantities. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. If we're looking at how we actually grow herbs, there are, of course, herbs that are annuals. You probably maybe use some of those in your garden right now, and you go buy them and you replace them every year. That's going to be things like cilantro, dill, chamomile. Then there are those perennials. Those are the ones that are coming back year after year. So mint, oregano, thyme. One I always point out as the cautionary tale here is mint. If you've ever grown mint in a raised bed, it can really take over really quickly. So that's one of the ones that we sometimes recommend, that maybe you grow that one in a container, or that you prune it back pretty often, because it will, when we talk about propagation, mint is one of the easiest ones to propagate. It tends to propagate and spread on its own quite easily. When we talk about a tender perennial, that's things like basil and rosemary and lemon verbena. Tender perennial is one that you might need to provide frost protection for. And if you don't provide that frost protection, then it may not make it through the winter to come back next year. And then we do have some that are biennials, which means they take 2 years to complete their life cycle. But often people buy those as annuals, which means that when you buy the plant or the starter, it's already been through the first year, so that by the time you get it, you can treat it like an annual. All right, I did want to point out, I put a couple fact sheets in the chat if you're interested. I did put the herb gardening for beginners in there, as well as one on processing herbs. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute as well. But I did put those in the chat if you're interested. And then here is a nice little chart that just talks about what the mature size of that plant will be, as well as if it's a perennial or annual, and some usages for that. And again, if you're interested, we will be putting up the PowerPoint so you can access that later. One thing I want to point out about mature sizes, if you are planning on keeping that as a perennial, make sure that you have enough room in your raised bed for the full size plant. A lot of times it's really easy when we plant plants, we put them in the bed or even the flower pot or whatever you're using. And it's a small plant to start with, and we don't think about the mature size of the plant, so we don't allow enough room for when it is matured. Okay, some growth requirements for herbs. Most of them are pretty similar to vegetables in that they're going to need 6 to 10 hours of light a day. They prefer sunlight. There are a few that can grow in shade, and I put a few of these down here as like chives, chamomile, and bay. They'll do okay in a shady location, but generally they prefer a little sun, and they also need a neutral pH of around 6.5, and that's pretty similar to vegetables as well. They like a loose, well-drained soil and a lot of organic matter. If you don't have much organic matter in your soil, you can put some peat moss in there. And again, this is pretty similar to vegetables, just to give it that water holding capacity. You don't want your herbs staying wet. We talk a little bit about that on this slide. We do need drainage. You don't want those roots getting wet because they are susceptible to root rot. And also the roots need oxygen. So they need to be able to spread out as much as they like so they can get the oxygen, and also the water can flow through there. There are some herbs that have a difficulty developing a root structure, and that can be compounded. You can have a lot more problems with that if you have clay in your soil. So again, some of the things that you can do is you can actually cultivate your soil a little bit more. You can kind of dig it up down to 12 or even 18 inches and loosen that soil a little bit. Or you can add that organic matter, something like peat or compost, to that to kind of loosen it up. And then it will be a little more herb friendly. And again, things like keeping your soil wet can damage those roots. Another option is to do container plants, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Or you can put drainage in if necessary. Some people will put drainage tiles, or even you can use like the little styrofoam packing peanuts if you're going to use a container. You can put those in there so it won't get too heavy. We used to say maybe you could put rocks in the bottom to help it drain, but if you're using a very big container, the rocks make it heavy. So you can actually use something like the styrofoam packing peanuts in the bottom to encourage drainage, but of course they need enough soil for the roots to spread out, and then you can put that down in the bottom to keep your container from getting too large and heavy. 2 exceptions or 3 exceptions we put here are mint, angelica, and lovage. Can take a little bit moist soil, but you don't want them to be, running wet, but they will take a little bit more wet soil. Some other considerations, again, we mentioned this just a little bit ago, is the perennial herbs in general. A lot of those may need a little bit of winter protection. And one thing you can do is mulch around them, and that will help protect the roots as well. Something else that you can do is you generally are probably going to prune those perennials back, and you want to wait until just before the spring growth starts. If you prune them in the fall when they've already went dormant, then if you happen to have any frost or freeze damage, then you're not going to have enough growth to make that okay. If you prune them, then you're going to have more damage, and you're going to have to prune that out. So it's better to wait after the winter, and then if there's damage, you're pruning off that damage instead of pruning them and then they get more damage, if that makes sense. Okay, another thing to think about is pest damage. A lot of the herbs aren't really that susceptible to pest damage because they have those scented oils in there, and a lot of insects don't like that. So you're going to normally have less damage on herbs than you would, say, a vegetable plant. But there are some things that will eat some herbs. You can still have some aphid, mite, and rust damage on some herbs. So you need to be looking out. For instance, I think of basil. Basil is one that there are a few insects that don't like basil, but that young tender growth, there are a lot of insects that will eat that. You want to generally treat that with cultural practices. So you might go around and just pick off any leaves that have been infected and pull off those insects, or you might try to spray them off with water. A strong shoot of water can sometimes spray off those insects. You generally don't want to use pesticides on your herbs if you can help it, and you never want to put pesticides on the portions of the herbs that are going to be edible. So there are some pesticides that you can use if you need to, but I would only use it on herbs that say you're using for scent production or something like that. You don't want to use herbicides on those not herbicides, I'm sorry, pesticides on the herbs that you're going to be harvesting to eat. Okay, so growing herbs in different types of containers or raised beds or things like that can work really well. So I included a couple pictures here of different options. They work well for limited space and difficult soil conditions, or somebody that's mobility limited. You can also grow herbs in window boxes if you don't have a lot of room. You can grow them very well in containers or flower pots or things like that. So they don't need a lot of space, and normally you don't need a whole lot of herbs. It's not like you have to go out there and plant an entire row of basil or a whole thing of chives. A lot of times just one or two plants is enough for your use. So you can do a lot with those herbs and not take up a whole lot of space. Here's another option. Of course, this one is made from a pallet. And I think this is so colorful and so pretty as a nice option that they've done there. They have a selection of quite a few herbs. The only thing that I see here that I might change is those ones on the top look like they might be a little too crowded. Once those plants get mature, they probably need a little bit more room there, but I think that's a beautiful arrangement the way they've done that there. And again, like I said, that's a pallet, but you could also use hanging baskets. You could do a vertical garden, flower pots, wheelbarrows, window boxes, wash tubs, really about anything you can think of. One thing you want to think about is you want to have good soil. Commercial media might be a good option in some of these containers. And you also want to make sure you have drainage. So if you're using a wash tub or a wheelbarrow, you may need to add drainage holes. And if it's very deep, you probably want something in the bottom, like we talked about a minute ago. You could have, if it's not too heavy, you could put rocks or something there for drainage, or you could use those styrofoam packing peanuts. You just make sure you have enough soil for the roots to have enough depth. All right, growing the herbs indoors. You can certainly grow them in maybe your kitchen window or something like that. Sometimes they may be less productive, and that's just going to be a factor of how much light they have. So if you do need to grow them indoors, we want you to try to select a south or west facing window, and that's going to give them the best light throughout the day and the most intense light that they need. You could actually grow them under grow lights if you have a place to do that, and that might make up for the light difference. In pots, they can grow well in a soilless media, and that would just be a commercial media that doesn't have a soil base. You may need to check that for pH and then add limestone if you need to increase it. And the other issue there, again, is to make sure you're ensuring that they have adequate drainage. You don't want those roots to get wet. Another thing that we always tell you is to make sure you water them correctly. And again, you want the media to kind of dry out and then you water it again. You don't ever want that soil or soilless media to be wet to the touch. They need enough water to drink it up and then to get dry again. So annual herbs, of course, can complete their entire life cycle indoors, but if you have a perennial, they can sometimes really struggle out indoors. So they really need to make sure that they have enough sunlight and also protection from the intense heat and wind. One of the things that you want to think about if you're growing them indoors is make sure they're not so close to the window that the window is magnifying that heat and actually burning them. So it can be a little bit of a challenge to grow them indoors, and sometimes they just do better outdoors. If they're in a pot or a container, you may need to water them more often simply because they don't have as much space for the roots to spread out. They may not be able to access the water that's available as well. And then you want to think about if you're growing them outdoors, remember we said some of those that were perennials might have some issues with frost. So you want to be thinking about how you're going to handle them when it comes time for frost. Again, we talked about that you could put some mulch around their base, and you actually may even need to cover some of them when it gets really cold. So propagation, how do we produce our herbs? You can, of course, sow them by seeds. And again, you're just going to do a lot of the same things that you do with your vegetables. You're going to just put them in a soil or quality media. You're going to keep the soil moist but not wet. And then you can transplant them outdoors after the danger of frost. And then if you need to fertilize them, you can fertilize them around the time that first true leaf appears. Most herbs don't require very much fertilizer. And again, you can do a soil test through WVU Extension and find out if your soil is lacking of anything. If you're using a soilless media, you shouldn't have trouble there. All right, transplants. This is the way most people will establish their herbs, is to actually purchase transplants through a nursery or something like that. Or maybe you can get some cuttings or something from one of your neighbors or something like that. We'll talk about that option here in just a minute. But once you get your transplant from somebody else, or you went and purchased it, you just want to make sure you're using healthy plants to start with. You want to be very careful about how you're handling those plants so you don't damage them, particularly their roots. You want to soak those roots well and then plant them on a shady day in the afternoon or early evening. You want to make sure you dug the hole big enough so that those roots can expand. And you also want to make sure that the soil around there is loose. Go ahead and loosen that soil very well, and then set the plants in there and press the soil firmly around those roots. Another option is stem cutting. And that's a very easy way to transplant many of the herbs that you might be growing in your garden. You're just going to cut 3 to 4 inches down on that stalk, and you want to do it at a 45-degree angle. You're going to do this in the late spring after the plant has flowered, if it's going to flower, and you want to make sure it's still in the growing stage so that it's not gone dormant yet. Then you can use like a rooting media. Root tone is one of those that's very common. You're going to dip it in that, and that's just going to encourage it to get roots very quickly. So some herbs like thyme, basil, rosemary, and mint, this one will work very well for those. Division is another one. This is where you're going to gently cut the crown and the root system into 2 or more parts. You're going to basically dig up the plant in its entire root system, and then you're going to cut it in 2. One thing I always want to remind everybody is when you're doing any of these, you want to work on a cool day, and you want to have sterilized tools. For either of these propagation methods, you want to make sure that you're sterilizing your tools very well. And the reason why you do a cool day is because you don't want to heat stress the plant. If you see anything that's dead or diseased tissue, you want to cut that out, because you always only want to use healthy parts of the plant. Then you're going to replant it in 2 or 3 portions, however many you've cut, and you always want to water these well. Again, this one works well for things like geraniums, tarragon, catnip, chamomile. Those can work well for this division option. The last one we're going to talk about is layering. And this is kind of where the stem portion of the plant will make new roots. It's basically that stem is going to reach over and make new roots, and you're just going to aid this process. So when they start making that little stem that's going to try to reach over and touch the ground, you're just going to make a couple little tiny cuts where the stem is starting to touch the soil. And you're going to coat that portion with a rooting media, and then you're going to cover that little touch where it's touching the soil with more soil. And that's just going to encourage it to stay down and start making roots. Once it has started to make a new plant there around that little root, and it can take months, it may take just a week or 2. It just depends on the plant. You're going to cut it apart, you're going to dig it up and move that portion to the new location. Layering works really well with some of the herbs such as sage, savory, and mint. And just that little bit of assistance will make that process work faster. Okay, so harvesting herbs, it's just going to depend on what type of herb it is. Again, some of the herbs you may be harvesting flowers, seeds, leaves. It just depends. Almost all these herbs, we want to harvest them when they're young and tender, because that's when the oils inside them are going to be at the best. And those oils are going to be whatever gives it the really scent flavor or the taste that you're going to like. You can use those fresh immediately, or you may move on to one of these processing things that we're going to talk about in just a minute. One thing you want to be aware of is you don't ever want to cut more than 1/3 of the plant off at a time, because it can really stunt the plant. Drying, there are 3 options for drying. You can dry in a dehydrator, you can air dry, or you could use the microwave, but the microwave is the least preferential option because it will damage it the most. You can freeze herbs. And you can do this by blanching them in boiling water and then immediately cooling them in ice. And then you're just going to spread them on a cookie sheet and freeze them. There are a few that you don't have to blanch, but most of the ones we recommend that you go ahead and blanch. A few that you don't have to are dill, chives, and basil. Another option is to just freeze them in those little ice cubes, and you can kind of chop them up and freeze them in ice cubes in a freezer tray. Some things you might just be harvesting the root, such as angelica. You want to make sure you dig up those roots early in the fall, wash them thoroughly, and then cut them into smaller sections. You're going to have to place them on a tray and dry them out, turning them pretty often. Again, you want to make sure that you cut these into fairly thin segments so that they actually thoroughly dry. If they don't, then they could rot later. And it can take weeks in order for that to happen. Seeds, you're just going to cut the seed head off of the plants, and then you can place them to air dry naturally. And then once they're dry, you store them in an airtight container. Some other options that are really fun and really easy to do is you can make an herb butter, and you're just going to add those chopped fresh herbs. And you can do blend one. One of my favorites is that cilantro and lime butter that we talk about there. And it's just cilantro, a little red pepper, and lime zest in regular butter. And it's delicious. We don't really talk about herb oils. Some people try to make herb oils, but in extension, we don't recommend that because there's just too much of a chance of that going rancid or having some other complications. So we do not recommend making your own herb oils. However, you can make an herb vinegar, which is kind of a nice treat. And basically you're just putting some herbs in vinegar, and then you need to let it set at least 7 days. Okay, so some herbs that can repel pests. The one everybody thinks about is marigolds. A lot of people put marigolds all around their garden. Chives, of course, is one of those little smelly ones that some deer and even aphids will stay away from. Lavender is one we like, but it can be unpleasant to mosquitoes, flies, and moths. Citronella is another one that I don't have on here, but citronella, a lot of you, if you camp out or if you have picnics outside, you may use citronella oil or citronella candles. Green onions is another one. It's very similar to chives, but a lot of cabbage worms and slugs don't really care for it. Oreganos can ward off mosquitoes and aphids and cabbage worms. Rosemary is particularly smelly to beetles, and again, cabbage worms as well. Mint is one of the ones that biting insects don't particularly like, so ants and other biting insects. And then sage deters cabbage moths and flea beetles, and thyme can sometimes be used to ward off deer. Herbs can also be used in your garden to attract pollinators. I know a lot of people are really interested in having pollinators in your garden, particularly if you're doing a lot of vegetable plants. You always want to encourage pollinators. So this one over here is the purple hyssop, and then this down here is the chives. Anything that makes a flower is probably going to be an attractant. This one up here is the lemon balm. Of course, bee balm is another one. And I'll just go through these pretty quick. You probably have seen most of these, but these are the ones that are common for scents: lavender, mint, cinnamon, and sage. Medicinal: aloe, lemon balm, St. John worts, and echinacea. Culinary: I mean, almost all the herbs that we use or pretty much have some culinary use. Basil, of course, for Italian dishes, casserole, fish sauces, and salads, fragrance. Chives, of course, baked potatoes are my favorite, but also casserole, soups, eggs, and cheese. Dill, pickles are probably the most common use of dill, but also salads, herbs, blends. Fennel, I think that's the one that people use in sausage a lot, meats. They have that unique licorice-like flavor. Marjoram, meats, soups, stuffing, and vegetables. Mint, jellies, teas, and some mint. Oregano, of course, that's another one that's used in a lot of Italian foods as well as Spanish and Mexican. Parsley, I think a lot of people use parsley for garnish, but it's also, they tell you to use parsley sometimes to chew to clean your teeth and your breath. I've heard that one before too. Garnish soups and salads. Rosemary is for meats and jellies. Sage I know that one's used a lot in sausage, sage sausage, but meats, fish, and stuffing. And that's what I have today. So our curb word for the day is just herbs. So I'll put that in there, just herbs. Oh, let me go back.
Thanks, Jodi. Anyone have any questions for Jodi while we have her? That was a great presentation, very thorough. I learned a lot.
All right, I'll put the link for today is right there. And do you want me to share screen so they can access the code word or the
Sure.
QR
Yeah.
code?
Yeah, that might be good before. Make sure you take the survey so you get the points and scan the QR code or type in the link.
The QR
Oh,
code is up there.
we got a question. What do I do about black spot on my mint and sage?
Oh, okay. Let me look it up because I'm not 100% sure. Hold on.
Any other questions while we're waiting? I know I've definitely been planting a lot of herbs. I like the smell, but also mosquitoes, they're already bad. So trying to ward off the mosquitoes around just around my yard.
Okay. I wanted to make sure. Can you still hear me? Black spot is fungal. That's what I was double checking. So you can use neem oil is one of the organically approved controls. So if you want to put a control on it, you can use neem oil. But then again, you may not want to put anything on anything that you're eating. So the other option is to just pinch it off. One of the best things that you can do for control is to make sure your watering practices. We always want to water to the roots and not to the top. And make sure you're watering in the morning and not in the evening.
Someone said they're having issues with the survey. I think there's some issues with Qualtrics, so we'll get it out on the Facebook page as soon as this
I
is
opened it
over.
earlier today to make sure it would load, but WVU has had a lot of issues today and yesterday,
Yeah.
so it could be.
We'll get it out. Thanks for everyone for attending. Any other last questions? All right. Thanks, Jodi.
Okay, Mary says
Have a
she's
nice
had the same
day.
sage plant for 15 years. That's pretty good.
That is nice. 15 years.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.